Well, I'm just a diplomat. I'm not an economist. I'm not a journalist. So don't expect me to say anything very dramatic. You know, diplomats never say no. If we say no, we're not a diplomat. So, but first of all, I would like to thank NDN for inviting me to participate in this event. It's an honor to join a group of such distinguished panelists. Luis Alberto Moreno, President of the Inter-American Bank, Nora Lusty from Colegio de Mexico, Paulo Sotero, Director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Brazil Institute and a dear friend. And it's also an honor to have Joe Garcia as the moderator. It's interesting when Paulo Sotero, he mentioned that there is a contrast between what the actions of government and what government officials tell people in Brazil in general. And this occurred to me to make a comparison to you so you can perhaps understand a little bit of our culture. For instance, when you are sick and ill in the United States and you go to the doctor will tell you if you have a cancer, look, you have cancer, you're going to die in 6 months. This is a card, this is an excellent shrink. I would really advise you, call him up. He's a very competent man. He'll help you. In Brazil, if you go to a doctor, no, but this happened to me, to my family. My father passed away a few years ago and he had cancer. And it's very interesting. He went to the doctor with my mother. And then my mother called me, look, your father, he has fever, he's not doing well. The doctor, he's positive, but he wants you to call him up. And then I called him up, look, I'm very sorry your father has cancer, I don't know, I don't want to tell him. And you know, this is how things are. In a way. But, well, anyway, the issue before us this afternoon is it's a very, very challenging one. No country in the world will be spared from this crisis. And Latin American countries, of course, will not be an exception. As an official of the Brazilian government, I will focus my comments, of course, on the impact of the crisis in Brazil. A few years from now, Brazil may be seen as one of the countries that was better able to weather a crisis, the likes of which we had not seen since the Great Depression. When I say this, it reminds me of a British joke, you know. Two British gentlemen met after a very long time. They were friends since, I don't know, school. And the other one asked the other, how is your wife? And the other one replied, in relation to what? I mean, it's a... when I say, no, because because Nora Lustig said that Brazil is a borderline country, and I don't know, you didn't say that explicitly, but I don't know, I gathered that the entire world is going to a recession. I don't know, but anyway, however comforting this assessment will be, the fact will be that Brazil will still have paid a heavy toll, and that it may take us a few years to return to the growth rate that we were experiencing until last September, when Brazil began to feel the full-blown impact of the crisis. Many of you have read in the papers just yesterday that in Brazil, growth from July to September this year was 6.8%. higher than the same period in 2007, and that the overall economic growth for the 4 quarters ending in September was 6.3%, which is very good for at least today's standards. The Brazilian economy is hence enjoying much more momentum than the global economy. Brazil has been growing continuously for 26 quarters. And in 2007, job creation reached a 4-decade peak. Our GDP at US $1.8 trillion in PPP terms, is the world's sixth largest, and our strong fundamentals were pointing to sustainable growth of our economy at around 5 to 6% a year. These growth rates were a direct result of hard work and perseverance on the part of our successive democratic governments, which succeeded in overcoming two obstacles that constrained Brazil's potential in the past. Inflation is subdued, and foreign debt has been more than offset by the increase in reserves. Thus, Brazil has been a net creditor nation since January 2008, for the first time in its history. In addition, unlike previous growth spurts, the economic expansion is translated into concrete purchasing power gains for the majority of the population. Brazil's cash transfer programs have been the subject of positive assessments by the World Bank and others. Now, more than 50% of our population belongs to the middle class, which has particular significance in a country such as Brazil with one of the highest rates of social inequality. Another source of economic strength is Brazil's highly diversified foreign trade profile in terms of both products and partners, which reflects the size and profile of its economy as well as strategic policy decisions made in the past. While Brazil is one of the main producers and exporters of agricultural products and foodstuffs, manufactured goods now represent over half of our total exports. The European Union and the United States are important trading partners, but so are Latin America, particularly South America and our Mercosur partners, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. While exports to developed partners have been increasing, export growth has been more dynamic with developing countries, which account for over 50% of our total exports at present. Moreover, Brazil's investment relationship with developed countries is becoming more balanced. Brazilian companies are increasingly investing abroad. Brazil has become an important investor in the United States and remains one of the largest recipients of U.S. investment in aggregate terms. Notwithstanding our increasing oil reserves, Brazil is fully committed to continuing to improve its energy mix, which has already become one of the cleanest in the world. In 2006, over 75% of electricity was generated by hydroelectric plants, and over 40% of total energy consumption came from renewable resources. Brazil has been leading efforts towards the development of renewable energies, particularly sugarcane ethanol, since the oil crisis of the 1970s. Over 90% of new cars sold in Brazil are flex fuel, so that they can use gas and ethanol, or ethanol. And it has been estimated that the ethanol industry has prevented annual emissions in the neighborhood of 33.2 million tons of CO2. In recent months, ethanol has surpassed oil as the main fuel for cars in Brazil. Oil is becoming the alternative fuel in Brazil. In November 2007, Petrobras oil company discovered off the coast of Rio de Janeiro what may be yet to be proved one of the largest oil and natural gas fields in the world. The Tupi oil field could raise the country's reserves by more than 50%. Even without Tupi, all investments are a little bit under consideration or reconsideration at present. Brazil's reserves are second only to Venezuela in Latin America. Brazil has been self-sufficient in oil production since 2006 for the first time. On November 15th, Brazil played an important role at the summit of the G20 countries in Washington and showed full willingness to work in close coordination with other leading economies to tackle the huge global challenges brought about the current crisis. We are looking forward to the next G20 summit to be hosted by the United Kingdom in April 2009, and we're looking forward, of course, to working with the new US administration. When Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs included Brazil in a list of 4 countries that have the potential to become major world economies by the year 2050, the BRIC countries, we saw it as a welcome responsibility rather than a reason to rest on our laurels. On April and May 2008, rating agencies upgraded Brazil by making it the 14th sovereign nation whose foreign currency debt was raised to investment grade. That upgrading reflected and highlighted the maturation of Brazil's institution and policy framework. Rather than a goal in itself, we see this recognition as the end of the beginning. In short, Brazil is well positioned to cope with this crisis, which is not only financial but also economic. Moreover, the Brazilian government has been taking many additional measures on the domestic front to boost confidence in our fundamentals. I'll mention a few. Easing of reserve requirements aimed at assisting smaller financial institutions, extension of trade financing, the establishment of special swap facilities in US dollars with the Federal Reserves, which has been mentioned previously, interventions by Brazil's central bank in foreign exchange markets to avoid excessive volatility, the adoption of anti-cyclical fiscal policy in 2009 to offset trends of economic deceleration. At the same time, we have been witnessing in Brazil a process of consolidation in the domestic banking industry, as Paulo Sotero mentioned. For example, the merger of Itaú and Unibanco last November created the largest bank in Latin America. It must be stressed that the Brazilian banking system is not exposed to losses on asset-backed securities and derivatives. However, some Brazilian banks and companies have suffered losses because of the recent volatility in foreign exchange markets and exposure to currency derivatives. These derivatives are funny creatures because when things are going well, they'll help you a little. They make you feel a little bit more comfortable. But when things turn south, you just lose everything. I mean, it's amazing. But contrary to trends elsewhere in the world, many Brazilian companies have been able to issue short-term commercial paper at record levels in recent days and weeks. Albeit our strengths and the measures that have been taken by our government and our private sector, the international financial and economic crisis is expected to cause a sharp decrease in growth rate in the last quarter of 2008. However, the Brazilian economy is expected to grow well above the world average, according to independent estimates, by 5.3% in 2008, reflecting the fact that we have been growing fast in the 3/4 quarters of this year, 2.4% in 2009, and 3.2% in 2010. These are not official figures. They're from the Intelligence Economic Unit. The main engine of our growth will continue to be our domestic market, while welcoming new trade and investment opportunities. Inflation is expected to remain subdued. Our domestic currency, which has depreciated sharply in recent months, going from 1.55 reals per dollar to around 2.45 reals per dollar, is expected to show some recovery in the short run. Lower domestic demand and commodity prices should prevent a pass-through to consumer prices, so inflation should remain subdued. A modest widening of our currency account deficit is expected, but it should remain close to around 2% in 2009 and 2010. Our exports should experience a contraction that may last for some time, but the widening of the current account should be contained by declines in imports and freight costs. Tax revenue should contract due to economic deceleration. However, this contraction should be moderate since Brazil's tax base is highly diversified among corporate income, wages, sales, foreign trade, industrial production, services, and fixed assets. Indeed, given that the Brazilian public sector is now net holder of foreign assets, currency depreciation has brought about a reduction in the net public debt GDP ratio, which is considered, as you know, a proxy of fiscal solvency. This ratio went down to 36.6% from 39.9%, a reduction of almost 3 percentage points. Brazil has done its homework. Our boat is strong enough to face rough waters, but it will take some time before it will be able to sail safely again at the speed it reached during the last years. That is a very high price to pay for a crisis originated elsewhere by a developing country with great potential but also with great social challenges. I was going to elaborate a little bit on our bilateral relations, but Paulo Sotero did it so well. I would only add a few things. You know, at least we cannot complain about the level of attention that the U.S. has given to Brazil. We don't see a quantity as an important matter. Perhaps what we value more is quality of attention. In these last 4 years, during the Bush administration, we have had many accomplishments in many areas. We started to, for instance, to cooperate in the production in biofuels. Just to mention one field of cooperation, we have been cooperating in many areas. And I would like also to call your attention that the important thing would be not to, perhaps not to try to reinvent the wheel, but build upon the present accomplishments. That's all about I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention.